The function of design is letting design function. That was a quote by Mika Kamarin, who is a designer. Welcome to our podcast. This is the first episode that I'm recording on the Tall Confidential podcast. And I'm very excited to be sharing not only information that I know, but also information that other people can bring. And I really want to help everyone who listens to this podcast gain a much deeper understanding about tiles, especially when it comes to, uh, you know, designing a bathroom or a kitchen or any flooring or wall space for that matter. This episode is going to be focused on understanding something that I call the tile nutrition label. And I know it sounds kind of funny in a way where you think of nutrition in something to do with food, but what we need to understand is that the ingredients that go into making any particular tile is not the same across the board. So what does that mean? If we have one particular porcelain tile and another porcelain tile, and if we want to compare them, they're not going to necessarily have the same ingredients. And if they don't have the same ingredients, they're not going to have the same properties as well. So when we decide on a particular tile, I think we need to be looking past just how it looks, but also understanding some of its properties as well. And this is what I mean by the nutrition label, because some of you may be already familiar with this, some of you not, but every tile that is manufactured by a reputable uh, manufacturer that takes some pride into their work has been tested, and they go through various testing. And what they do is they basically classify the tile under various categories, and those categories is what that label basically identifies. And that's what we're going to discuss in this podcast. So, if you were wondering where you find this, well, typically when you go on a website for a, let's say, a tile store, you can click on the tile, and typically it'll be on the under the like the additional information. Some tile stores will have it in a PDF format provided by the manufacturer, and so you can click on it and download it and actually view some of the details. But essentially, you may look at it and it may not mean anything to you. But if you're working with an installer, or if you're working with a designer, it'd be good to bring up this subject so that the particular tile that you're working with is going to be suitable for the space that you're going to be using it in. So, for instance, just how you probably go to the grocery store and you might be wondering, well, is this particular food going to be, healthy for me or meet my dietary requirements? And you look at the nutrition label on the back of the food. In that same way of thinking, I think that we all should be looking at tiles in that same way and looking at the label and saying, is this particular tile, although it may look amazing, or although it might meet every other criteria that I want in terms of size, pattern, you name it, but is it suitable from other points of view? For instance, does it have a fairly good scratch resistance if I'm putting it in an area where I'm expecting a lot of traffic? Does it have a good slip resistance? If I'm putting it in a foyer where I expect water, maybe from snow and other things to be present there, well, maybe I want a tile that has a very low slip resistance. So, and maybe these other things, for instance, lighting. Maybe you want to brighten up a room and you prefer, and maybe you would want to have a tile that is polished there, because that's going to brighten up your room. So these are all these kind of items that is that is very important in the design aspect of selecting a tile. And so let's get right into it. We're going to go down the list of what you typically might find on the nutrition label. And I use the term nutrition label just as a way of referring to it. It's not actually called a nutrition label, just so you know. It's the technical maybe term for it might be the technical information about the tile. Okay, so in any case, let's go down the list, and I am going to talk about every single item that you might find on that tile spec sheet. Welcome to the Tile Confidential podcast. My name is Saul, an author, tile installer, and owner of Bella Tile Store. I want to help you learn about tile to make choosing tile for your next home improvement project easy. You're about to embark on a journey into the world of tiles and learn from myself and other leading experts in the industry, such as manufacturers, designers, retailers, architects, and much more. If I can help you feel confident when it comes to tile, then I've done my job. So without further ado, let's get into our episode. All right, we're back here, and let's start going through the list here. The first one I'm going to talk to you about is the color body related to the tile. So that's typically one thing you'll see on the label, and it'll say either the tile is color body or non-color body. So what does that actually mean? So color body means that the manufacturer has added a dye that closely resembles the color at the tile surface. So if you have let's say, black tile, and forget about the fact that it might be polished or matte. And if you were to look at the edge of that tile, if it's a typical non-color body tile, that color will typically be like a kind of a clay, kind of brownish kind of color. If it's a color body tile, the side of that tile and even the back of the tile, the entire interior of the tile will be kind of a black color. It won't be exact match to the surface of the tile, but it will be fairly close. And the importance of this is that if someone ever chips that tile by accident, and sometimes that can happen from heavy things falling on the tile and whatnot, repairing a tile like that, it poses a lot of issues. First of all, you may not even find this tile anymore. I mean, tiles are constantly changing. It's like fashion. The tile you have installed in your house right now, let's say you got it installed yesterday or even today. In about 2 years, you might never even see that tile ever again. They may never even produce it ever again. And if they do, it may not be the same dye lot, a term which means that the color tone of that particular tile, the batch that color was made under, may not exist ever again. So if you were to want to replace that tile, you actually experience a lot of problems because the tile may not be available, the color may not match. So it's a lot of things that are going to be a problem for you. And so having a color body tile basically kind of makes that chip less of an issue for you. Because the color inside the tile matches the surface, it kind of hides it better. And that's sort of why this is very important. And a lot of time people don't pay attention to this fact. But if you're putting tile in an area that you might think that at some point something heavy might fall, let's say it's in a garage, and it's in a shop, and there's tools and stuff, and well, you want to pick something that's color body. And that's really why color body is important. So the next item is called full body, or sometimes referred to as thorough body. So what that means is that's a type of tile that has the same appearance throughout the entire body of the tile. So it means that if you cut the tile in half and look at a cross section, you see the same color and pattern in the middle of the tile surface as you see on the top. So what that means is that not only in the case of a color match, but also we also have the pattern also feeding through. Now, these particular tiles are manufactured very differently. They have very different properties, and they have a lot of limitations as well. So they don't, for instance, they don't come in polished finish, like a glossy finish. Um, and that's part of the reason for that they're not that popular, because they tend to really be used in places like outdoor environments, or like around pool sites, any place that um, maybe requires something that is extremely durable, because that's what they are. They're very durable tiles, and they're durable against abrasion, cracks, because basically, if you think about it, the ingredients of what made that tile run all the way from the surface all the way throughout the entire tile. So, in the case of, for instance, a polished finished tile, you're not going to have the same kind of ingredients on the surface as you do in the middle of the tile. If you ever looked at a tile from on the side, if it's cut, you notice a thin layer of glazing on the top. Well, that glaze is never going to be as abrasion resistant to, for instance, the abrasion resistance of the tile in the middle of it. So that's where these tiles become very important. So sometimes you might notice that a particular tile will have the designation of full body, or otherwise called thorough body. The next item we're going to discuss is called the PEI rating. And what that stands for is Porcelain Enamel Institute. And what this rating essentially measures is the tile surface glaze's resistance to damage. So this measurement applies to the strength of the enamel glaze that's applied to the tile during manufacturing. And why is this important? Well, you want to pay attention to the PEI because for your particular application, you might want a tile that has a slightly higher um, resistance to damage for its glaze. Because this particular classification for tile has 5 classes. And so, as you can see, and I'm going to describe in a second, um, certain tiles will not be suitable in certain areas. As much as they might look amazing, a particular tile might be only rated for walls. So if a tile has, for instance, a class 0 PEI rating, that tile is classified as a light duty wall only tile and should never be installed underfoot. Why? Because you're going to see a ton of scratch marks on that tile. It just has not passed the specific tests to meet the requirements of what a tile is supposed to be for a floor tile. Otherwise, it may be too slippery. It could be a bunch of things about it, but it just will not be suitable for a floor. And so you should never install it on a floor if you don't want to have problems later on. The other classes are class 1, which is again another wall application, but in this case, all wall application. So the difference between class 0 and class 1 is that class 0 is only for light duty walls. Class 1 is for all wall applications. Class 2 is walls and light duty floors, such as like residential bathrooms. Class 3 is residential floors and walls. Class 4 are residential floors and walls, along with a medium commercial. So medium commercial would be like office buildings, um, uh, more or less, I would say office buildings or like schools. Class 5 is where we get into heavy duty commercial applications. So you can think of them as places like warehouses, um, airports, factories, maybe laboratories. So these are the kind of places where you might accept with a class 5. So that's what really PEI stands for, and that's what its importance is when it comes to selecting tile. Moving along here, we have the next item is shade variation. And that's typically another factor you'll see. And because it has a lot of ratings attached to it as well, categories. So this refers to the range of color or pattern variations that you might expect on a tile. If you ever notice, you might go to a showroom and you might see a particular tile on the wall and you'd be like, oh, this is amazing. I want this tile. And let's say it passes every other criteria and you've listened to all my podcast episodes, everything's great. And then you order the tile and it arrives and you notice, well, this is not even the same tile that I was expecting. It's very different. Well, that's really what shade variation is that when they're producing a particular tile, sometimes on purpose, manufacturers create shade variation to kind of create a random effect on the surface of wherever it's being installed on. This is typically true for like porcelain tiles that might look like natural stone, like limestone or travertine, where you don't want the exact same tile installed right beside each other. Even the marble tiles, you don't want to see a wall with marble veining running from one corner to the other, all exactly the same. That looks weird. So you want to, so that's why they create shade variation. So that's why certain tiles will have a very high shade variation. Certain tiles will have a fairly low shade variation. Ceramic tiles, glazed wall ceramic tiles, tend to have a fairly low shade variation, and typically to be a V0. Um, some tiles have a slightly more difference in color or pattern or texture, and although it's there, it's very unnoticeable. And that's called a V1. Again, the V here stands for variation. The next item is V2, and these are tiles that are distinguishable differences in the color pattern, texture. Um, so you are very likely to notice the differences between them. Um, V3 is, again, a little bit more, they vary significantly from one another. And V4 is where there's substantial differences between the tiles. Now, this is an important one to consider because if a tile, a particular tile has um, um, in its box a lot of variations between one tile to another, you should definitely consider mixing boxes or really randomizing the tiles that are picked out of the box and paying close attention to the randomization while it's being installed. Because if you don't, you might create patches of a particular texture or color, not realizing that you need to randomize. So that's where it becomes important. Sometimes some tiles they want to kind of create a kind of like a fish scale or kind of a rippled effect, like it's like kind of like waterfall kind of effect. Sometimes it's like a brick type of looking like a tile, and so bricks tend to have a lot of randomization. So you want to make sure that when you're installing it, you're not putting similar shades of of tiles beside each other. Really, that's what's important. The next item we're going to talk about here is frost resistance. This is quite important. I remember a time where we had a client give us a call about installing some tile on their porch. And the first question I asked her was, is your tiles frost resistant? And she didn't even know. And thankfully, the person who sold her the tile had considered the fact that tiles are frost resistant, but you can't know, what, if that's the case, especially some of the big box retail stores. No one's going to be there to help. If people are shopping there, you might just pick out a tile because it looks great, but it's not frost resistance. So what is frost resistance? It's the ability of the tile to withstand freezing temperatures. And why this is important is because if a particular tile can absorb some small amount of water into it, it's going to experience expansion and contraction. And as a result of these extreme temperatures, what's going to happen is that tile is going to crack. And all it takes is one season like that, and you're going to show up and that all the tiles are completely fractured. So that's why frost resistance is very important for outdoor purposes, especially in cold environments where you're going to see a lot of snow. This is definitely the other thing about these frost resistant tiles also is that they're very um, uh, kind of like high abrasion resistance to them. So if you're shoveling snow and all that kind of stuff, they're going to be pretty durable for that. The next thing you might see on the tile nutrition label is the stain resistance. And this is basically, as the name suggests, is this resistance to stains. Stains can be things like coffee, wine, ketchup, mustards, um, things that you might expect to stain uh, certain stones, or it's basically its ability to resist stains. Now, most porcelain tiles are pretty good in stain resistance because to be classified as a porcelain tile, a tile must have a very, very low water absorption. In fact, you should have less than 0.05% water absorption. And we'll talk about water absorption in a second. But so if a tile does not absorb anything, it's not going to get stained very easily. But in any case, there is still a class system for this stain resistance of the tile. So if you're particularly putting tile in, let's say you have a wine cellar and you're going to have a lot of parties, people drinking wine in the basement or in one of your rooms, and you're going to put tile all over that place. Well, you probably want to make sure that you pick a tile that has high stain resistance. So there's 5 classes to this particular category, from class 1, all the way where in the testing process, what the manufacturer does is they apply a particular stain. It can be multiple things that they're testing on. And then they test to see if the stain is removed. So in this case, if it's a class 1, the stain was not removed. So that's a very kind of a low stain resistance. Class 2, stain was removed using a solvent, like an acetone, for instance. Class 3, the stain is removed, but you have to use a strong chemical cleaning agent. Class 4, stain is removed using a weak commercial agent. And then the stain is removed using hot water in class 5. So as you kind of go to the higher classes, you start to notice that, um, the stain is removed very easily in class 5. So you want to make sure that you are picking a class 5 stain resistant tile in the applications that matters. Now, this doesn't require in all applications. You have to look at it. If you're, for instance, installing tiles in a residential area, you're never going to be working with strong commercial cleaning agents to begin with. So you probably not going to be creating stains that are that intense, or worrying about spills that might be that intense that require a commercial cleaning agent. The next item, which is quite important for residential purposes, but also commercial as well, is the coefficient of restitution. And This is basically measures the impact resistance of the tile. And what they do is they measure this by dropping a steel ball from a specific height and measuring the height of the rebound of that ball. And, you know, this is kind of like measuring the, again, the density, the strength of that tile, and it's called the coefficient of restitution. Another factor is, or item on the list that you might come across, is the bending resistance. Now, bending resistance becomes really important for large format tiles. And nowadays, most of the tiles are getting much bigger. A lot of people are now working with bigger porcelain slabs. And the bending resistance becomes much more important the longer the tile gets. Because if you're trying to be flush with all the other tiles around the area, bending resistance is important. You do not want to be working with a tile that has a bow to it and expect to get a particular type of installation. So the bending resistance, as the name suggests, measures the test of how well a tile resists bending. And um, uh, basically, the less likely that that tile is bent to begin with, the more resistance going to have to bending. And moreover, if you're going to be installing it in certain areas like a floor, and uh, you want to make sure that and maybe it's going to have a very heavy traffic on it. Let's say we're talking about a commercial setting in this case. We want to make sure that if heavy objects are going over those tiles, it's not causing a strong bend on those tiles and causing them to crack. The next item on the list is one of my favorite, is the MOHS, otherwise the Moss hardness test. So this test is a measure of the deep abrasion resistance of the tile. It's actually used by a lot of mineralogists around the world to test the hardness of different minerals. And so this scale is actually based on a series of minerals. I'll quickly go over them, but it's not something that you need to really worry about memorizing. But what they basically do is they scratch the tile with one of these minerals. And the mineral that scratches ends up scratching the tile. That actually you see a mark with it. Becomes the level in which that tile is rated for its scratch resistance. So these minerals that we're scratching tile with all have a specific density, and so obviously if you scratch something less dense, if you scratch something that's has a certain density with something that's less dense, well, you're never going to be able to scratch that thing. But if you scratch something with something that's more dense, then you're going to be able to scratch it. So that's really what it is. It's being able to identify the scratch resistance. And so these minerals are talc, they're gypsum, they're calcite, they're fluorite, apatite, feldspar, quartz, topaz, corundum, and diamond. Obviously, no one's scratching the tiles with diamond. You're never going to have it at anything more stronger than diamond as far as mineralogy is concerned. So basically, and most of the time they're scratching with the first 9, and there's 10 of them. Just to clarify. So when you see this rating on the tile label or nutritional label, it's important to consider what it actually means in practical settings, you want to say. So, um, you know, think of it like this: quartz is typically a 7 out of 10 on the Mohs scale. And what do we use quartz for? For kitchen countertops, like so where we can kind of cook and cut it with knife and stuff, and you're not supposed to scratch it. So A 7 is a fairly good number to be at for a particular porcelain tile if you're installing it in a high traffic environment or even a kitchen. Um, so most glazed porcelain tiles are categorized as 7. Ceramic tiles will be a 5 or a 6, so they're soft. That's why you never put ceramic tiles on the floor. Unglazed porcelain tiles are a little bit stronger because of the glaze is not present there. So they tend to be an 8. So they're a lot stronger. So you might expect to put them in places like outdoors. So that's what that is. Again, important to understand where you're putting it and whether or not it needs a particular level of scratch resistance. Now we get into water absorption rating. We talked about this a little bit earlier. The water absorption rates are a measure of how much moisture a specific type of tiles would like to absorb. So when they're testing that, what they do is they fill up a tank of water, they put the tile inside it, then they remove it, and then they measure its density compared to its density before you place it inside. And sometimes they might be weighing it as well. So, basically, what we don't want is a tile to absorb water because then it won't be suitable in high moisture environments or even cold environments. So, basically, this gets categorized into 4 subdivisions. We got non-vitreous tiles, which their water absorption is more than 7%. So these are typically low density tiles. They are very likely to be like ceramic tiles or clay based tiles. Then we have semi-vitreous tiles or medium density tiles, which are their water absorption is more than 3%, but not more than 7%. Then we have vitreous tiles, which are high density tiles with water absorption of more than 0.5%, but no more than 3%. And we haven't gotten to porcelain yet. Porcelain is impervious. So it's categorized as an extremely high density and a tile with 0.5% or less water absorption. And this is where the porcelain tiles are generally categorized as. And if you don't see this particular rating on a porcelain tile, it's not a true porcelain tile. Then we have slip resistance. I'm sure this is something that you might care about, especially when you're putting tiles in wet environments. You want to make sure that nobody slips. So typically you'll see a rating as identified as the dynamic coefficient of friction. And that number is typically around 0.42. If you see 0.42, that's a pretty good slip resistance for a tile. The higher the number gets, the better it is. So for interior floors, you want 0.42 as the dynamic coefficient of friction. For exterior floors, you want 0.6 or higher for dynamic coefficient of friction. The other thing you might also see is the chemical resistance of the tile. And this is a particular test they do on a tile where a tile sample is placed, with a continuous contact with a particular chemical, and and this simply give you about 24 hours, and then they rinse the surface and examine the surface of the tile for um, variations caused by the chemical. So whether if it's like an acid or a base, if it's caused any changes on the surface of the tile. And this is important, if you are putting it in areas where you expect the tiles to be exposed to harsh chemicals. Not so much in residential applications because the chemicals are not going to be that strong, but in commercial applications, absolutely going to be very important. But it's also important in areas where maybe you're an avid cook and you're going to be cooking all the time and you're going to be working with all kinds of ingredients from ketchups to and vinegars and you're going to be washing the floors a lot. And so that might be important for you as well. But in any case, that's what chemical resistance is. You'll typically see that rating as well. And as well, you might see other things that are also important. So, for instance, the thickness of the tile, which will be there. And some tiles are maybe, typically porcelain tiles. You might find them around, anywhere between 9 to 12 millimeters. Ceramic tiles tend to be around, 5/16 in terms of inches. Um, Nowadays, porcelain tile slabs are coming out, thin porcelain patterns, and they can go anywhere between 3 millimeter all the way up to about 12 millimeter. Um, the other thing you might also see is the country of origin. And this is a good one to keep in mind because the country of origin will likely also affect um, the kind of standardizations that have been met on the tile. Now, typically, most tiles coming out of Europe, specifically Italy, Spain, they tend to be, even Portugal as well, they tend to be rigorously tested for these particular items that I just discussed, and it'll be listed and provided for you. Um, as some manufacturers that are more white label, that are just producing it for other brands, may not necessarily provide this information. So you might wonder, well, wait a minute, why is this tile doesn't even have it? Well, maybe because they never tested for it. And so you're going in blind. He says, as if, let's say, you when bought a particular, I'm going to use an example here, like pizza, and you have no idea how much calories is in that pizza. It could be 10,000, it could be 500. You don't know. In that same sense, it's a gamble. And so that tile, no matter what the people can say, oh, it's a great tile, it's high quality, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff, it means nothing because it doesn't have a number attached to it. So everything has to be measured before you can actually say and there's no such thing as this is a good tile. Good means what? With respect to your particular needs. And so that's why I bring the example of the nutrition label. You can go to the grocery section and you might look at yogurt, and all those yogurts are good. There's no reason they're not good. That's why they're in the grocery store, that particular grocery store. They're not going to carry it if they don't think it's good. But for your particular dietary needs, a certain yogurt may not be necessarily suitable. So you're going to look at the ingredients, you might look at the nutrition label, you're going to pick at the yogurt that basically fits your particular diet. In that same sense, you're looking at what's going to be suitable for your particular space. So that's really wanted to discuss with you in this podcast episode about these nutrition labels. Thank you very much for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.